Hello and welcome. I'm Scott Borders, and welcome to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. Today we find ourselves in Millhousen, Indiana, and we're at the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. Joining me today is Kenny Steer, and you're a high school junior, and you have a lot of information about this particular church. Kenny, do me a favor and tell me, as I'm driving into Millhousen, I can see this incredibly tall steeple of the church. Tell me a little about that.
So when they built this church, they built the steeple about 170 feet tall, which makes it the tallest building in the whole town, actually.
And you said you have a grandfather that actually has to climb up there and adjust the clock tower every now and then, or the clock in the tower, is that correct?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, Grandpa fixed the clock. It was broken down for about 10 years. He fixed it and has it going, and you hear it ringing from my house even.
Now, they tell me you're one of the experts on the historical knowledge about this church. Tell me a little bit about some of the history of the church.
So basically around 1834, there's about 13 families that came from Germany, and they came up through Cincinnati, and when they founded the town, since they were all German Catholics, they built the town around the church, essentially.
Okay.
And so they had their first mass in the main founder's cabin, Maximillian Schneider. It was about 20 by 24 feet, small little place.
And this was roughly when?
1834.
Okay.
Which makes it one of the oldest church communities, Catholic church communities in the neighboring counties.
Okay, and tell me a little bit about, I keep hearing this name involved with this church of St. Denis. Tell me a little bit about that and what that story is.
So St. Denis is about a 7-mile drive from here. It was a small little parish that around the very late 1800s, late 1890s,
okay,
they founded St. Denis Church. The pastor that was here at that time, his little brother, younger brother, helped him out, was an assistant pastor here, and he ended up going and founding St. Denis Church, which just recently they closed down in 2013, and they merged back with this parish.
Now, Kenny, as I'm looking around, again, it's a beautiful sanctuary, and I was viewing some of the art. Something struck me in particular. In the back corner of the sanctuary, there is a saint who appears to be headless, with his head being held in his left arm. You're going to have to explain that to me.
Yep, so the statue in the back of the church came from the old St. Denis Church before it closed. That is St. Denis, and story has it that he was beheaded and was so intent on preaching the gospel that he walked several miles and continued preaching headless, holding his head in his hand.
It certainly is a unique piece of art in this church. Okay, Kenny, tell me, if you would, a little bit about the first church that was in or around this site a little bit.
Sure. So about 6 years after they founded the town, they ended up building the first church on this ground here. And it was called the Chapel of St Boniface, who's the apostle of Germany, where they came from.
Okay.
And it was about 20 by 24 feet, and it didn't have heat or anything, so in the winter months, they say, and no chairs either. So they had to bring their own stools and often stomp the ground just to try to keep warm.
And I believe somewhere in the sanctuary here, there is actually a model of that original church. Is that correct?
In the back, there's a little model that supposedly they built from the actual wood that the first church was built out of.
Now, something I noticed coming in, and I tend to notice this about the interiors of a lot of churches that we've looked at, this is by far one of the most beautiful array of stained glass windows that I've seen. And you said they were built in Germany, is that correct?
They imported the stained glass windows from Germany, I assume, when they built the church.
And it is absolutely beautiful when the sun comes into this building. So it's a very beautiful facility. Okay, Kenny, this isn't actually the original church building from 1834. So tell me a little bit about what we're standing in and which phase it's in.
So this is the third church that this parish has been through, and it was built in the 1860s, and there was a little scuffle that happened when it was built, because when the first church was built, they called it the Chapel of St Boniface, so that was kind of the name the parish took. Mm-hmm. Well, when the pastor that raised the money to build the third church, the one we're standing in, there was a little disagreement about the naming. He wanted to name it after Mary, and it got so heated that the pastor ended up leaving for 6 months and building stopped, but eventually it came back and built.
Now, Kenny, I understand that there were some changes, at least cosmetically, in this sanctuary within the 1970s. Tell me a little about that.
Right, so when the church was first built, the whole building was frescoed with art. The ceiling had arches about it. The back sanctuary, it was full of decoration and paintings. That is the only original painting to remain in the building. And then in the 1970s, there was a beam in the roof that had cracked, and with that, they had to make some repairs. So they removed the roof for a whole winter, and that caused a lot of water damage. So that's what gives it the simpler look it has today.
So it was just kind of painted over, but the actual art used to be on the walls here in the sanctuary, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now tell me a little bit about this communion railing I see.
So when the church was first here, the floors up here were all wooden, and there was a beautiful hand-carved communion railing all around the altar. And when Vatican II changes came, they had to remove that.
Okay, Kenny, tell me a little bit, as we know churches that are usually this old in age have some kind of story with a fire, and there's one here too as well.
Yeah, so in about 1928, there was a fire that broke out in the roof, and the only firefighting equipment the town had was a hand-operated pumper, which they couldn't reach that high, obviously. So there was a group of men that came with buckets of water and climbed up the tower to douse the fire and ended up putting it out.
Now tell me a little bit about the rectory of the church.
So the rectory was built by our first resident pastor, and when he came, he built it. He was his own architect, he was his own builder, he built it himself, and for only $800, and it's still used today as the parish office.
I noticed a couple of things, Kenny, outside the church, and one of those first things I noticed was that shrine outside. Tell me a little about that shrine.
Yeah, the Lady of Fatima shrine out there was donated at a cost of around $1,500 by a Feldman family, and was built in 1954, and the yard in front of it we now use for the annual parish auction.
Now there's something else kind of significant. At one time there was a school attached, not attached to the building, but there was a school across the street here that had a relationship with the church. Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, so the school across the road was built in 1940, and the Sisters of St. Francis from Oldenburg taught grades 1 through 8, and it's 4 classrooms that it has in it. And due to a lack of funding and a lack of teaching sisters, they ended up closing the school in 1971.
Now let me ask you something. I noticed a cemetery too, and I understand that there are people that come from all over this part of Indiana to check out that cemetery. Why is that?
Yeah, so there's well over 1,000 headstones back in the cemetery, and when originally it was a much more vibrant town and parish, we had a lot more parishioners, and so now all the descendants come from all over to try to find their family history back in the cemetery.
So Kenny Steer, I want to thank you for being a part of our interview today and giving us a lot of history of this beautiful, beautiful church. Thank you so much.
Sure, I enjoyed it.
We are going to close now from Millhousen, Indiana, in the Immaculate Conception Church here in Millhousen. This has been Scott Borders for History in Your Own Backyard. Remember, travel slowly and stop often.